All right, well, welcome to GBTA's Mid-Year Summit and Annual Business Meeting. This next session is entitled Compliance Solutions for a New Landscape. So a couple housekeeping items to note. First of all, registrants' microphones and videos will not be enabled throughout the session. If you do have questions, please place your questions into the Q&A box and they will be answered throughout the session if time permits. However, if they're not able to answer the questions during the session live today, we will certainly respond after the webinar via email. Remember to keep your event hub handy. This is your gateway to all of the different sessions today. Now, before we move into the content, let's hear a word from the session sponsor, CWT.
At CWT, our purpose is simple. It's to connect people and help business succeed. And for generations, company and government employees around the world have relied on us for efficient, safe and secure travel experiences using our innovative services and technologies. The easing of certain travel limitations in various geographies, coupled with the successful implementation of CWT's Travel Essentials proposition, which you can find on our website, mycwt.com, assures a safe resumption of business travel for all. And at the same time, we're excited to be further ramping up our operational capacity, reopening offices to best support our customers and their business travel needs.
Wonderful. Now, I'd like to move into our session today and let's welcome our speakers. First, we have Brennan, CEO and founder with Tracker Software Technologies. And joining Liam, we have JoHannah Greene, Client Solutions Manager with Fox World Travel. Over to you, Liam and JoHannah.
Thank you. We're thrilled to be here. Very excited about this session today. And I think the fact that Liam and I are able to speak together is so important to bring two different pieces of this topic to light. I think to start out, we hear the word compliance, and depending on where you are in a company, it really has a different meaning to everybody. They're kind of siloed in what compliance means to them. So I think to start this conversation, the best thing to do is to qualify what compliance is and what we're going to really be sharing today. From my side, from the TMC perspective, when we discuss compliance, it often is the type that is tied to risk and duty of care. So travel managers who are tracking travelers, making sure that they're safe, making sure that the destination is safe. But really, there's so many parts and pieces to compliance within a company. So I think the best thing to do at this point to start to cover that topic is hand it over to you, Liam, for a bit to share what some of those other vital aspects are.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Yeah, indeed. And compliance, as we say, it's the same word and it's related to the same travel event. So for one person going on that business travel trip, there's a potential to create risks to the organization and to the traveler themselves across those multiple areas of different areas of compliance. And this isn't a new phenomenon. This has certainly always been a problem, but it hasn't really got the sea level of interest over the last period of time until the COVID pandemic arrived. And in March 2020, when companies were scrambling, first of all, to locate where their people were and bring them back home at the start of the pandemic, that highlighted a number of processes internally that companies have decided that we need to potentially improve on this environment. And during the initial phase in March, or the first 3 months or so, nobody knew where the COVID situation was going to go. As it became more clear that it was going to become a longer term issue, companies started looking internally to re-engineer their complete travel processes. So it wasn't just a case of looking at from the travel vertical. Other stakeholders in the organization were now coming into the process so that they could better work with their travel colleagues and determine other issues, so that if the travel processes were being re-engineered, they should be re-engineered to take into account these new environments here. So different titles, different groups, mobility tends to be HR or immigration, tax can have a different name in different companies, payroll, tax, legal, safety, all of those have a different focus on exactly what's happening to a particular traveler. And if we look at some of the phenomena that has arisen since the pandemic has taken place, there has been travel. There still has been some elements of essential travel. That travel is being managed in many organizations by emergency committees. But as we get back to normal travel, some new phenomena are starting to appear. Certainly, I'm speaking to you here from Europe. So Brexit is going to have an impact in terms of UK travelers now moving into the European Schengen area, where from now, for the first time, they'll have to start counting the number of days that they're spending in that Schengen area. And they've never had to do that before, so there's no systems in place, there's no processes in place. And that's on a rolling 90 and 180 days. And it includes leisure time. So if I take a month on my holidays in a European location, I need to count those days, or they could potentially impact my ability to travel in Q4 of a year, or whether I need a work permit to carry that out. Also within the EU, the Posted Worker Directive is starting to take an impact. And again, there hasn't been significant volumes of travel yet for this impact to be really heard, felt, or understood by organizations. But during this period of time, our clients are starting to talk across these multiple stakeholders so that they can introduce these complete or holistic views of the travel implications of one particular trip that particular traveler might take. So in an RFP process for somebody who's looking to purchase technology now, we're starting to see up to 7, 8 different stakeholders involved. So for travel companies used to managing only with the TMC world and maybe a travel group, purchasing technology to manage travel in the future is starting to move across those different boundaries. JoHannah?
Yeah, and to your point, I think we all have seen that post-March 2020, right, post-COVID, the biggest piece that shifted or changed in these companies was that bridge that started to be built between different stakeholders within the company. Really, in organizations, we've never seen that big picture conversation before, began there when the pandemic struck. And it's really interesting because previously to COVID, risk teams may be involved somewhat in the travel piece, but oftentimes they were kind of in the background as long as they knew that there was a tool available if they needed to use it or something like that. But then when the pandemic hit, and up till now currently, we've seen those risk teams move front and center. And they're really the ones who began to make the decisions about who's going to travel, when they can travel, where they can travel to. And then the other piece is we see other leadership, CEOs and CFOs requesting information on travel policy and best practices and reporting. They just want to be a little bit more involved and in the know than before. So it's interesting too, because we also have had other companies that maybe didn't even have a risk team before COVID. And then all of a sudden they worked very quickly to either create one or at least create that function internally at their companies. I think with all of that said, and realizing that companies at that point did begin to realize that compliance is a holistic measure, the other piece that played into that were approvals within a company. And we began to see approval processes that maybe didn't exist before at all within a company, all of a sudden be the first order of business right then in March of 2020. And, initially, the majority of the time, previous to COVID, they were always set up in an approval process with a budget in mind, right? That was the goal, is to keep the bottom line low. But the other piece is those approvals weren't very flexible. They oftentimes used to be really, really manual, requiring a ticket either be stopped or not issued at all until that approval was okayed. But we saw all of that begin to evolve, and to the point where they have, we now have different levels of approval, to the point where maybe it just is a message, an FYI message that goes to a supervisor. And so now in the new landscape, we've seen these clients who went from no approval whatsoever to some type for the protection of their travelers, rather than with the budget in mind. And, you know, we really see most clients talking about maintaining that some sort of approval process moving forward, even as things get back to normal. But again, unlike before, it really doesn't have anything to do with bottom line. It's really related to the well-being, the security, the comfort, the safety of their travelers, and all the other pieces of compliance that you've mentioned. And I think the other interesting thing is it's not nearly as labor intensive as maybe it used to be either. So with that said, before I hand it over, we can go forward to about 2 slides. And you can share, Liam, a little bit about what that evolution and what all those different pieces of the approval looks like on that next slide.
Sure. And to talk about those situations that evolved during last year, quite a lot of emergency COVID committees were established. Travel was halted, additional forms were put on corporate intranets, employees were filling out these Excel sheets or an email justifications for essential travel if that was allowed to happen based on government regulations. So all of that manual process really can't come forward into the new year. When you start look at travel ramping back up, the ability to do that manually is going to become too difficult. So companies are looking to automate those processes now, whereby you can get to a situation where a company can look at all of the relevant risks associated with a particular piece of travel, and then greenlight as many of those trips as possible. So if we look at here, this be a typical pre-trip approval environment. There's a number of different models that companies use. Some is pre-booking, some are post-booking. In this environment here, you've got the traditional budget approval, so the trip can be killed if the line manager certainly doesn't want to approve it. And then when you move into the security or risk management environment, the third box there, the country security risk, that's probably the more traditional risk of traveling to an unsafe location, Afghanistan or Syria. The risk teams would have managed that type of travel very, very closely. But now in a post-COVID world, it's Leicester, it's Paris, it's New York, all different cities that would not have fit across a security register, potentially could be no-go areas based on a COVID environment. So the ability to very, very quickly and automatically manage that particular COVID situation and or refer that to the security team. So if it's safe, if the COVID levels are low, if there's government regulations, the traveler can enter into that particular environment. And traveler systems and IATA and travel management companies have all developed very strong API connectivity now into these known data sets so that this can be automated. Around the time last year, we saw people coming up with lots and lots of different websites who say, I can get into this country if I do that. And that there really was no certainty around what that information is. Think companies like IATA, who control most of the airline environments, if it's not in their system, you're not getting on the aircraft. So they're starting to rise to the force, having some strong elements of data. Companies are relying on that particular information quite strongly. So once that security risk element is handled, then the new area is this area of immigration, tax, posted worker, and social security. So these are the mobility groups and the other stakeholders who've now joined with these multiple groups internally and are saying, well, we'd like just a couple of extra questions to be asked of that traveler so that while they're checking the COVID situation, automatically we can check whether there's a work permit required, whether there's elements of an entry visa. Do I need a social security certificate? Do I need to register with labor authorities in my destination? Will I cause a state tax liability crossing over from New Hampshire to Massachusetts? And all of those risks can be flagged at the same time. So this new era gives these different stakeholders the opportunity to piggyback on the process that the travel groups can implement. And in the sort of work we're doing with multinationals at the moment, these multiple stakeholder teams are working very closely to make sure that this type of question is asked of a traveler in a pre-trip environment. Now, there's some initial reticence, our guys won't do that, our people won't answer those questions. There's a resistance to change in the existing process. But business travelers are some of the most adept at changing processes. If you look at a business traveler 20 years ago compared to an elite business traveler now, would anybody have ever envisaged that that elite business traveler would be tagging their own bag, putting the label on and pushing their own bag down a chute and clicking through landside with a barcode. So business travelers are very adept, and asking one or two additional questions in a streamlined process is going to lead to high levels of adoption and allow those other stakeholders to piggyback on what the travel ecosystem is already offering to those teams. So the sort of theme we're going to be talking about here today is walking down the corridor to talk to those colleagues so that you can put in place an integrated process that those travelers can answer very quickly and get a green light, either go, no go, or go with administration. And quite often, you're not going to be stopped going if there's a potential tax liability, but the tax teams want to know about it so they can deal with it in the background. You might get a stop or a temporary stop if there's an immigration issue, or until the posted worker registration is completed. So these new eras and these new areas of compliance are coming down the tracks in this new world. And by re-engineering these processes over the last year, companies are in much better position now to make sure that the company is protected, the traveler is protected, and then all of those sometimes tedious tax, immigration, and social security issues, they're all handled in a timely manner as well, with no surprises at the other end. JoHannah.
Yeah, those are really great points. I think to kind of pick out that piece about a traveler doing what they need to do and how that evolves over time. At the end of the day, a traveler will be compliant if they just understand the why behind it often. And so it's really just about communicating to them, look, we know there are extra steps now when you have to travel. We know that there are other questions you are required to be answering, but this is the why behind it. And then we do see that compliance from the traveler side as well pretty easily, and they get behind the process. Another point to that too is, regardless of if it's the risk team or the legal team, or like you mentioned, the tax piece in a company, they all have their own piece or their own part to play in this compliance space, but they all have one common thing across the board, and that's to protect their employee and also in turn protect the company. And so that always is going to begin at the very start of understanding where their employee is and where their employee needs to travel. And, we talked about it back in March 2020, there were those people who were scrambling to find travelers because they maybe didn't have the approval piece in place, or they didn't have the traveler tracker piece in place. And nobody wants a repeat of that. And so I think, besides that, going down the corridor and having those conversations, the other piece is understanding, tracking employees and how the approval part of that. So really at the very beginning, right, when you're making your reservation or you're getting ready to, and you need to have that approval piece, how important that piece alone is in regards to this overarching compliance.
Yeah, absolutely. And for companies, the duty of care now extends to asking the right question and making sure that they can document that those questions were asked. So if we look at global tax authorities, we talked about it being maybe a tedious part of business travel and extended travel. But if we look at in a post-COVID environment, most global revenue authorities are broke at the moment. So they're going to be turning over rocks to try and understand, well, where can we secure revenues? And global multinationals have done reasonably well during the pandemic environment. So there will be an easy target. So we're predicting an increase in that type of tax audit or tax inspection. And corporates need to be able to resist those types of audits by showing those authorities that they, at the start of the trip, took reasonable steps. Ignorance is never usually an excuse in these environments. So by asking the question, the company is protecting itself, first of all. It's protecting the traveler in terms of making sure that there's no compensation and differences for them, but it's also giving them the relevant data to be able to deal with any element of a regulatory audit in terms of tax or immigration, in terms of managing any particular audit that could come their way from any one of these regulatory bodies. And from the point of view of the pre-trip element of this, then when the trip actually takes place, that trip can change. So by feeding data backwards from the TMC systems back into tracking tools, then the client and the company can then also keep a a track of the trip as it continues. The trip may get extended. There may be a third country added. There may be additional changes of activities. So what's important is that as much data can be collected as at the start of the trip in a pre-trip environment. And this is one area where TMCs might have to make some modifications. Quite often, the purpose or the trip activity is a low-level description. So to be able to deal with immigration, tax, posted worker type of obligations, sometimes it needs to be a little bit more than meetings internal or meetings external. You might need to ask your travelers, are you delivering training? Are you receiving training? Are you fixing a machine? What are you actually doing in that country is going to become as important as being able to get there and get into that. Because if we can define what those activities are at this pre-trip level, then many more trips will get green lighted, and then you're only focused on the ones that are likely to cause some element of a compliance risk for the particular company. And this data is sitting in the TMC systems, and it's a very simple API process now to push that data backwards into the system so that the tax, the immigration, the other compliance partners that are sitting down the hall from those travel managers, that they're able to use that data to manage their particular vertical segment and see how it affects the company overall.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to see us from the TMC side, and then from your professional landscape too, that we both understand the impact that we're seeing regarding compliance and approval, and the overarching bigger education is universal, right? And it doesn't matter which side of the table that you're sitting on. Everybody is starting to understand the importance of this. And the interesting piece is the positive that we're seeing with clients. It is creating, of course, new territory for them to navigate in some cases, but it really is proving to the employee that they are well taken care of, and their safety is important to their employer. And so it's causing that loyalty internally as well, that they are, really being cared for. And then on the other side, we see leaders in these companies who have become more reliant on the professional side of things, whether it be their TMC or professionals in your role, that they're looking to us to understand things like proper documentation or information on where to go to obtain that. So I really feel that that's something that is continuing to evolve and obviously is here to stay as well.
Yeah, and absolutely. And that duty of care is universal across all those functions. But what's important is the fact that this gives an opportunity for travel managers to use their existing ecosystems. It's not like this is a completely new landscape and everything has to change. Many travel managers have spent many years building up solid online booking tools, different interfaces with travel management systems, different interfaces with expense environments. None of those need to change, but sometimes the data in those systems might need to come out or might need to be shared with different groupings. There could be greater integration with HRIS systems. Some of the tax and immigration teams need additional profile information, but that usually is sitting in the organization, usually in a Workday or a PeopleSoft or Oracle type system that can easily be fed into these systems as well. So if this was 20 years ago, this would be a much more difficult integration environment. But with the way technology has moved nowadays and with the API connectivity that there is between systems, we see travel managers here. And when we run RFPs with our clients, the travel manager is usually the strongest person on the group in terms of managing the process because they've got usually the best technology in place. The HR, the mobility teams tend to be running behind and managing on Excel environments, whereas this gives them an opportunity to utilize the data that the travel manager has. So as JoHannah mentioned, this is an opportunity for travel managers to reach down the hall, reach down the corridor to their colleagues and say, well, we've got data here. How can it help you with your situation? How can it help you with your vertical? And then when all of those different stakeholders are talking together, the company overall will be in a better place because they're managing so many more different compliance elements. But also the traveler is going to be in a situation where they're having a single process. What's the worst case scenario is that you have a siloed group of stakeholders who introduce different processes to travelers and send them forms or send them requirements after a trip or at the end of a month and ask them to complete additional information that could be handled either in a pre-trip environment or in an integration with the travel management systems that are in place there today.
Yeah, and I think if we could just go to the last slide that Liam and I have, just as a summary of some things that how travel's changed, but to really elaborate on that travel manager piece, right? Like we have travel managers, our goal is on this webinar that we want them to understand the importance of, if they haven't yet begun to engage those key players in their companies, that not to be overwhelmed, right? Like we understand travel managers' job has always been complicated. It's always been layered. But I think now in this current atmosphere and moving forward, that role is going to not just stay, unfortunately, a little complicated, but really, really vital to this overarching piece of compliance in the company. But also at the same time, it's not a scary undertaking necessarily. We're not saying this falls on a travel manager's shoulders to organize all this, but rather, reach out to that the very first part that you can do is maybe reach out to your HR team. HR is a wonderful resource to work with you in understanding what other silos in your company should be managing their piece of compliance and really help to have that conversation. And this conversation certainly isn't to make a travel manager think that their workload has to increase, but rather just be aware that maybe these conversations are even already being had internally. And, the ability for you to step in and say, hey, let's see what we can all do to work together to make this one big umbrella is really, really vital and important. I think the other thing too is previously, to your point, the idea of approvals used to be weighty and so much work, but it's the phrases approvals and compliance don't necessarily need to be scary anymore or that restrictive, because as you talked about, there are so many pieces that are automated now, and it's necessary and vital to a program to be successful and for a company to be safe and successful, but it certainly doesn't need to be overwhelming. I think we have maybe just a couple minutes, so I don't know if there were any questions that came in that we would like to take a couple minutes and answer.
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions there at the moment, JoHannah.
Okay.
I'll just underline in terms of this. If we were to say the theme for today is walk down the corridor. This is happening in your business today. If you're running a managed travel program, your business travelers are causing these risks and will continue to cause these risks with the resumption of travel. And this has been a chance to re-engineer those processes without throwing out all of your kit. So it's a case of just saying, well, how can we use what we've got to support those additional silos in an organization? And let's hope they're not silos. They should all be stakeholders sitting alongside each other. And in some of the work we've done in the last year, the most successful companies have been the ones who come to an RFP with 5, 6, or 7 different stakeholders as part of that RFP. It's not run by travel, it's not run by mobility or by tax. It's a joint bid with 6 or 7 different stakeholders and everybody getting their little piece of compliance out of it. So walk down the corridor.
Absolutely. And educate the travelers and your employees, right? Because they're the only ones that can make the whole thing successful. So.
Well, thank you so much to you both, Liam and JoHannah. That was a great session. And thank you all for joining us today on this particular session. So up next, we have our education topic number 3, looking ahead, the future of travel. So please join us there. And remember to keep your event hub handy. Thank you so much.